This is the World History Unit 4 Part 1 Extra Credit Test Review. And like always, I'm going to go through these terms and these questions, and I am going to discuss these and let you know what my thoughts on these are. And we're going to start with some general terms, some older terms like democracy. Remember what that is? It's a little bit of review. Remember that demo means people, and a democracy is when the people rule, the people vote. You can have a direct democracy in which all the people vote on issues, or you can have some kind of a representative democracy like Rome had. Remember that a theocracy, theo means God, and a theocracy is when the religious leaders rule, so that the government and the religion, or the government and the church, you might say, are one. An absolute monarchy, and a monarch with absolute power over everything is an absolute monarch, and he has an absolute monarchy. Let's not forget what monotheism is. Monotheism is when you have a religion with a belief in one God. That's monotheism. Christianity is an example. Judaism is an example. Islam is an example, which we're going to study next. There's no Islam on this test, but that's our next topic. And then we have polytheism. Polytheism is belief in many gods, and we have lots of examples of that, the latest being Hinduism. So the Byzantine Empire, what can we say about that? Remember that the eastern part of the old Roman Empire that the Emperor Diocletian split in the year 284, and that the later Emperor Theodosius split again, this time permanently, in the year 395. The East survived that split, the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The West eventually did not, and we later called it this surviving eastern half of the old Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. So what's Constantinople? This was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. It was a huge city. It was wealthy from trade, and this wealth was what made the Byzantine Empire so strong and so durable. And just like in the West, sports were a huge part of the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine culture, especially the chariot races. Political parties actually affiliated themselves with certain sports teams, and political connections and agendas seem to rise and fall with the outcomes of chariot races. In fact, a chariot race actually caused a serious set of riots in the year 532 that had to be put down by the army, and that those series of riots killed 30,000 people. And Constantinople also boasted a massive hippodrome. A hippodrome is a horse racing track, and theirs could seat 100,000 people. That's huge even by today's standards. So what's the big deal about the location of Constantinople, hence the location of the much more vast Byzantine Empire that was around it? But the Constantinople lay between two seas and between two continents. It lay between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and between Europe and Asia. It was also on a peninsula that was very easy to defend, and this unique location made it a hub of intercontinental trade. So architectural achievements, that's what's next right there, as we can see. Well, keep in mind the hippodrome. Also, keep in mind the Hagia Sophia, that huge church using the old Roman architecture, such as the huge dome that it featured. Justinian, he was one of our most famous Byzantine emperors. And what are some of his achievements? Let's not forget the Justinian Code. That provided legal guidance in the Byzantine Empire for 900 years. And he also had the Hagia Sophia built, that huge church that I just mentioned. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, what do we know about that? This was Christianity as practiced by the eastern half, or Byzantine half, of the old Roman Empire. The Byzantine emperor was the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, primarily in the sense that he appointed its leader, the patriarch. And so he who controls appointments, as a rule of thumb, controls the church. And so this church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, does not actually follow the Catholic Pope, but rather this patriarch. The last Byzantine emperor actually died in the year 1453, but the Eastern Orthodox Church still has a patriarch. The current one is named Bartholomew I. You can look him up on YouTube. There's interviews and all kinds of things about him. The Eastern Orthodox Church conducts services in Greek, whereas the Western Catholic Church conducts its services in Latin, at least from a historical point of view. Obviously, somewhat recently, within the last 50 or 60 years, the Catholic Church started going over to local languages that were easier for churchgoers to understand. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, priests can marry, but perhaps the biggest difference between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church is its use of icons, and we saw pictures of icons in our content. These are images often of saints that you can touch and you can hold them. Some are large, some are small. And Eastern Orthodox worshipers have used these for centuries as aids to focus their prayer and their worship. The problem with these icons was that many people in the West had serious questions about the use of them. Are you using them to help you worship God and feel closer to God, or are you really worshiping the icon? That was the big question, because that would be idolatry, and that's against the Ten Commandments. That's a sin. So this becomes especially controversial if miracles or healings are attributed to some of these icons. And this dispute over icons was a primary reason for the Great Schism of 1054, which was the last thing that we studied in this under this particular unit, when the Christian church split between East and West. Nevertheless, there are similarities. Both churches worship Jesus, and both churches believe in the Bible as their holy book. So, the early kingdoms, well, Germanic tribes that conquered Rome, as we know, in the West, and then settled into kingdoms like, for example, the Franks were these early kingdoms. In a way, you could say they conquered Rome, but they were also conquered by Rome because they all became Christian. The Middle Ages and the fall of Rome. Think of all, and we've talked about this numerous times, think about all of the institutions that were lost. Central government, roads and bridges in disrepair, cities and towns depopulated, life becoming more rural, travel unsafe, trade collapsing, no unified system of banking or currency, education and literacy disappearing, no more unified language. Now, none of this happened overnight. It took place over a couple of centuries. Charlemagne. Who was this Charlemagne? First, Charlemagne was a king of the Franks. Those were his people. That was his kingdom. Add to that, king of the Lombards. Add to that, emperor of the Romans, crowned by the Pope of the Catholic Church. Later, the Holy Roman Empire would look back to this crowning of Charlemagne in the year 800 as Emperor of the Romans as its own beginning, even though nobody was actually using the full term Holy Roman Empire yet in the time of Charlemagne. So let's talk about this Holy Roman Empire. What was it? The Holy Roman Empire began as a collaboration and a melding, if you will, between the church and these Germanic kingdoms to somehow restore at least some of what was lost with the fall of Rome in the late 400s. You remember that 476 is our kind of go-to year. It's hard to pin down an actual year when the fall of Rome was actually a process that took a long time and happened slowly. But if you want to choose a year, 476 is a good one because that's when the last Roman emperor was taken off the throne. Before 1157, let's go back to this Holy Roman Empire idea. Before the year 1157, this new realm that Charlemagne was made the emperor of, um, this realm was called simply the Roman Empire. The term holy was added to the term Roman Empire in 1157 by a king named Frederick I, or you can also call him Frederick Barbarossa, which means red beard, actually, Barbarossa. And the reason he added the word holy to the name Roman Empire was to reflect Frederick's ambition to spread his kingdom south and dominate both Italy and the Pope. But whether it's called the Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire, for centuries, this newer Roman Empire was simply a mere shadow, a cheap imitation, a knockoff, if you will, of the old Roman Empire, which fell for us at the end of Unit 2 in 476. Well, the feudal system, what is that? Keep in mind that the feudal system is a social, political, economic, defensive system that's designed to defend kingdoms against invasion and to reduce internal fighting between medieval lords. Social pyramid. That's a big part of the way we understand the feudal system. Can you recognize that feudal system? Can you create or can you recognize that social pyramid? Can you create that social pyramid? It has four main levels. Remember, kings are on top, followed by lords just under the king. Below them, knights, and below them, peasants and or serfs. So the Vikings, who are these Vikings? They're a major reason for the development of the feudal system because of their invasions. The Vikings are Scandinavians, and they're not just invaders. They're traders, they're explorers, they're business people, and they're also raiders. From an explorer point of view, keep in mind that the Vikings explore vast amounts of the North Atlantic. Eric the Red discovered Greenland, and his son Leif Erikson actually discovered Newfoundland in North America 500 years before Columbus did it. Invasions, they occurred from the Vikings all over Europe. And they were, like I said, a major reason for the development of the feudal system in the first place. So this idea of manorialism, what is manorialism? Manorialism is the economic side of feudalism. The two, feudalism and manorialism, go hand in hand. A manor, and that's where you get the word memorialism, is not just a large house or a castle. It is all the land given to a noble lord by a king, and it's everything and everyone on that land. The serfs that work that land, that live on that land, they are not allowed to leave it. They are, as we say, tied to the land. Manors are designed to be as self-sufficient as possible in an economic environment where travel and trade are barely happening, cash is scarce, towns are small and distant from each other. So moving on to the power of the church, that's our last big item right here. Remember, after the fall of Rome, the Catholic Church was the only powerful institution left to unify Western Europe. Luckily, almost everyone is of the same faith. And so the church, remember, is a dispenser, no, not a dispenser, the dispenser of the sacraments. And the sacraments are channels through which you get God's grace and therefore God's salvation, because God's grace is the only thing that can give you salvation. So everybody, from the top to the bottom of society, from the highest king to the lowest serf, participates in the sacraments through the church. That makes the church absolutely critical to your spiritual survival. So, how did the church unify Europe? Several ways. The church is the one glue left after the fall of Rome that holds Europe together at this time. Economically, remember that it's a time of little cash. So, land is the most important currency in the economy. There just aren't, there are people minting coins, but there's no unified government. And so this lord mints his coins and this lord mints his coins, and they all look different and they're all different weights, and there's no way to kind of compare them to each other. How much is this coin worth versus this coin? So the only real unified currency is land. And so the church is the biggest land owner. Keep in mind that the amount of land that it owns just keeps growing and growing as noblemen die and often leave their lands to the church, hoping that it will get them into heaven. The church also unified Europe politically. The church can use the fear of excommunication to get feudal lords to act right. For example, the church has a law called the Truce of God, which heavily restricts, the number of days out of the year that feudal lords can go to war against each other. Anyone who violates this law, any lord who violates this law, can get kicked out of the church, excommunicated, denied the sacraments, denied God's grace, and denied salvation after they died. So there's a big incentive to do what the church tells you to do. Culturally, keep in mind that the church is the number one patron of the arts. In other words, it's the number one customer of art. In a world where there is very little literacy, the church uses art to instruct believers about their religion, about the Bible. Lots of art depicts biblical stories. The church also builds churches all over Europe in the Gothic style, which is also full of symbolism and Christianity. We did an entire Google form on that. We watched a video, answered questions. Be sure that you know how to recognize a Gothic church. Probably the easiest way to do that is the rose window, pointed arches. Also, the church unified Europe intellectually, and that doesn't seem to be here. So I'm just going to put that right here as well. Let me see if I can put a tab. I'm going to say intellectual. I hope I can spell it. Intellectually. Question mark, just to make it unified. The one thing that the church had a lot of was monasteries, where monks lived and spent all day learning and copying manuscripts. There was no printing press. The printing press is not going to come along until the 1450s. Books and manuscripts had to be copied by hand. It was a painstaking process, and it required a great deal of care and expertise. And these monasteries were essential to protecting Europe's intellectual resources, books, etc. And they were also essential in creating enough manuscripts to allow the church to spread the faith. So that's all I really have to say about this review. I think if you know all that I've mentioned, you should get a wonderful grade on the test. So, my number one goal is to help you do as well as possible. You have to meet me halfway. You have to pull your weight. I can't do this for you. All I can do is put the resources at your fingertips. The rest is up to you. I know that many of you will use these resources and get a good grade. So good luck.